Since the start of the war in Ukraine on 24th of February, the West has been planning to stop Putin at any cost. So, in addition to sending a lot of weapons to reinforce the Ukrainian army, both the United States and the European Union and many other allied governments have taken the decision to stifle the Russian economy as a means of punishment and pressure. To this end, they have decided to launch on Putin's country one of the toughest sanctions packages in international politics in living memory. However, look at what Putin himself said back in March.
Putin sees positive developments in negotiations with Ukraine and believes sanctions are an opportunity for Russia.
Yes, that's right. According to the Russian president, the sanctions are far from being a threat, but rather an opportunity to achieve Russian self-sufficiency once and for all, and thus strengthen the country's economic independence. Come on, practically a blessing from the heaven. Yes, I know, it sounds very strange. Something like a typical political marketing farce. But what if Putin was actually right? Could sanctions really end up helping Russia?
Russian ruble at 7-year high despite sanctions.
As you can see, the Russian currency seems to be enjoying one of its best periods in years. Something that in theory would be quite in line with Vladimir Putin's claim that sanctions are a blessing in disguise. Now, is this enough to claim that the sanctions on Russia are not working? What shape is the Russian economy currently in? And what's more, why on earth has the value of the ruble skyrocketed after the sanctions? Well, if you want to know the answers to these questions, stay on VisualEconomik. Let's get started. On the 23rd of February 2022, just one day before the invasion of Ukraine, the European Union approved 7 packages with tough sanctions against Mother Russia. These sanctions packages included personal sanctions against Russian politicians, such as freezing assets abroad and banning entry into the EU, as well as punitive elements against the country's own economy. Well, it is precisely the latter that interests us now. In fact, you will see that among the ways Europe has chosen to attack the Russian economy, 3 main types of sanctions can be found. Firstly, the import ban. These sanctions prevent Russia from acquiring certain European products, such as state-of-the-art electronic components, equipment for key industries, and luxury goods, to the chagrin of oligarchs, naturally. Secondly, Russia has been prevented from selling raw materials, such as coal, gold, and timber to Europe. And as you may already know, along the same lines, it has also planned to progressively prohibit the purchase of Russian oil. Finally, financial sanctions have been imposed, which have 2 very clear implications. On the one hand, the Russian central bank's foreign reserves were frozen, leaving Putin with little room to stabilize the value of the ruble. On the other, most Russian banks have been excluded from the SWIFT system, which is a messaging system that greatly facilitates international transfers between financial institutions. These were the measures taken by the European Union, but ultimately they are very similar to the measures taken by the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, along with many other countries. And guess what? Even if Putin says otherwise, the truth is that the effects of the sanctions soon took effect and led to a massive outflow of foreign capital. In fact, do you know what happened on 16th of May 2022? McDonald's left Russia. You can't deny that was symbolic. As I'm sure many of you know, the arrival of McDonald's in Russia in 1990 was seen as the end of Soviet isolation and the opening of a new Russia to the world. And yet, 30 years later, Russia is once again isolated. Because, as you can already guess, the list of companies that have left the country is very long, and includes heavyweights such as Nestle, Apple, and Microsoft. But this does not remain in the sphere of private companies alone. What is certain is that, these days, most developed countries do not want to maintain strong relations with Putin. As you can see on this map, Moscow has only managed to find some political support in a few countries in Africa and Asia. But, so how does that work? If many companies have left the country, and Russia has become very isolated from virtually all the major markets in the world, why, according to Putin, are sanctions good for Russia? Why is the ruble stronger than ever?
The swinging of the ruble.
The graph you see on screen shows the evolution of the ruble exchange rate with the dollar. That is, how many dollars that you'd get for 1 ruble. As you can see, until February, everything looked stable. However, look at what happened following the invasion of Ukraine. Just when the international sanctions were approved, the value of the ruble plummeted. However, as you probably all know, not least because the media have not stopped repeating it, the value of the ruble has recovered to even exceed pre-war levels. The question is, what the heck happened? What did Russia do to make the ruble look even stronger than it had been before the war? Well, let's take it one step at a time. The initial depreciation that you have seen had basically two causes. First of all, the countries of the West both banned the Russian central bank and many of Russia's commercial banks from using the international financial system and accessing their foreign exchange reserves. So what does that mean? The Russian central bank ceased to have access to the euros and dollars it had spread around the world, while many Russian commercial banks could no longer use the SWIFT system. Conclusion: that the Russian financial system ceased to be able to easily offer foreign currencies to Russians. For this reason, and because of the uncertainty and fear generated regarding the future of the ruble and the Russian economy, foreign currencies began to be heavily traded. Let's just say that suddenly many Russians became afraid of keeping their savings in rubles. In other words, what happened after the imposition of the first sanctions was a classic supply and demand problem, as foreign currencies became very scarce, and what's more, demand for them increased. The value of dollars and euros skyrocketed. In other words, the value of the ruble plummeted. And so the question is, what happened for the situation to completely turn around shortly thereafter? Well, basically, two things happened. Firstly, the sanctions on Russian trade were asymmetric. That is to say, they were tougher on imports from this country than on its exports. Because of course, we're talking about Russia, a country that is basically an exporter of raw materials. For example, in 2020, gas and especially oil accounted for more than 40% of all the country's exports. And evidently, the European Union, its best customer, has not yet sanctioned its gas exports and is just beginning to reduce its purchases of Russian oil. What Western countries have done, however, has been to heavily sanction imports of intermediate goods and technology. In other words, the European Union, the United States, and the rest of the allies are making it very difficult for Russia to buy supplies such as engine parts, advanced chemical products, electronic chips, and in general, any elements that Russian factories need to maintain their production. And as Russia is a country very dependent on this type of intermediate supplies, you can imagine that its foreign purchases have plummeted. So, we have Europe continuing to buy gas and oil, which causes foreign currency inflows into Russia. And at the same time, Russia can't buy all the supplies it would like. So, the demand for dollars, euros, and other currencies has been greatly reduced. To top it all off, do you remember that after the invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin began to demand that European countries pay for gas in rubles? Well, it's a similar story. And that's not all. Check it out.
6th of September 2022, China agrees to pay for Russian gas in rubles and yen.
The result? Enormous upward pressure on the ruble. In other words, all of the above is what has caused the value of the ruble to soar against other currencies, such as the dollar. Whether this scenario is positive for Russia is quite another matter, but I can already tell you that it is not. But for now, let's not get sidetracked. I've told you that something else also happened. You see, as soon as the sanctions started, the Russian government began to implement financial repression measures to reduce the demand for foreign currency. Basically, high taxes were imposed on the exchange of rubles for dollars, euros, or pounds, and at the same time, the deposits that Russians could have in foreign currency were limited. And what would you do if you were not allowed to save in euros or dollars, or buy things in those currencies? Well, obviously, you wouldn't want to have euros or dollars, so their demand would fall, and so would their price. To make matters worse, the Russian government also restricted foreign investors from selling financial stakes in certain companies considered strategic. And voila, there we have it. These are the reasons that explain the increase in the value of the ruble during these months. As you can see, it has nothing to do with the sanctions not working. In fact, behind the revaluation of the ruble are the sanctions themselves. But I know what many of you may be thinking at this very moment. Wait. Isn't a strong ruble supposed to be a good thing for the well-being of Russians? After all, it means they have more purchasing power, doesn't it? Well, in a way, yes, and at the same time, no. Let me explain. As we've seen, the West has curbed Russian imports. That is to say, no matter how strong the ruble is, this does not allow them to buy many things outside Russia. So in this sense, the exchange rate becomes irrelevant. But on the other hand, the appreciation of the ruble is positive for Russians, insofar as it can help keep inflation expectations stable. Clearly, given the choice, it is better to opt for stability than for a currency in free fall. But be that as it may, you can see that it doesn't really make much sense to look at the exchange rate to find out what effect the sanctions are having on the Russian economy. In a way, the restrictions are making the exchange rate sort of artificial. But then, why is it constantly used by so many analysts and the media?
Russian data is a pain in the neck.
If analysts use the exchange rate, it is basically because they have no other choice. In order to carry out an economic analysis, at least two conditions must be met. Firstly, that the data exist, and second, that they are reliable. And in the Russian case, I'm afraid neither is true. Look at this.
Russia appoints Economy Ministry official to head Statistics Institute.
In short, Rosstat, the Russian Federation's state statistics service, had been providing inconsistent, overly optimistic economic data for years, with constant methodological revisions. And guess what? That was just the perfect excuse for Putin to take away what little independence the agency had, putting it directly under the Ministry of Economy. As we saw in a past video on the Russian elections, it would not be the first time that Putin had massively manipulated the country's data for his own interests. And evidently, at the moment, there is no greater interest for Putin than to make the world believe that everything is going smoothly and at full sail. But that's not all. We've just said that in order to analyze data, it first has to exist. Well, do you know what? Unreliability aside, here lies the second problem, that the Russian government, by now, directly running the statistics agency, has turned off the data tab. As soon as the war started, many significant statistics, such as imports and exports, stopped being published, leaving analysts in the dark. So most were left to look only at a few statistics that are published on a regular basis, such as the exchange rate. But then, how on earth can we know the true economic effect of the sanctions? Well, don't worry, we can find a solution. Listen up.
The real effects of sanctions.
There are still heroes without capes in this world. A handful of economists have spent months collecting data from Russian primary sources, private consulting agencies, and other hard-to-access sources. And with all this, they have recently published a thorough study on the evolution of the Russian economy since Putin unleashed the firestorm over Ukraine. And what does this study say? Well, Putin should be more than a little concerned. Take a look at this chart. As I already mentioned, the war has made it difficult for Russia to import intermediate supplies. Well, as Putin's country is very dependent on all these goods, shortages are being generated, which is causing many companies to have serious supply problems, which in turn, and along with the stall on imports, is causing Russian families to be unable to access many products. And this is causing a huge slump in consumption. And keep in mind that as time goes by, things will get even worse. Do you want an example? 95% of passenger volume is carried on foreign-made aircraft. So lack of access to imported spare parts may cause the Russian operational fleet to shrink as aircraft drop out of service due to a lack of spare parts. Check this out. Even at the level of pharmaceuticals, the country could have a serious problem because around 80% of the national production depends on imported raw materials. Raw materials that in many cases are no longer arriving. And not only because of direct restrictions, but also indirect ones. Sanctions are hitting transport to and from Russia hard. However, despite all of this, Putin has been claiming since the beginning of the war that the problem of intermediate goods was irrelevant. According to Putin, Russia would be able to replace what it imported from Europe and the United States with imports from China. Now, did this claim hold up? Well, the truth is that between March and June, exports from China were down 15% compared to the same period in 2021. So no, Putin has not only failed to replace Western imports with Chinese ones, but also purchases from the Asian giant have also been reduced. And wait a minute, that's not the end of it. Russia is also losing talent in droves. This is something we have covered in one of our videos on VisualEconomik. The departure of Western companies has caused many of their workers to leave the country as well. According to the authors of the study, more than 500,000 workers have been exiled since companies began to leave as a result of the war. Naturally, many of them who are highly educated employees, who are essential for the smooth running of the Russian economic fabric. And the Russian government itself expects another 200,000 workers from the technology sector alone to leave the country within the next 3 years. And we're talking about the Russian government estimate. Obviously, the reality could be much worse. On top of this, even if the ruble exchange rate remains strong, Russian year-on-year inflation has been exceeding 15% every month since the invasion. In fact, Russia is expected to end the year with a budget deficit despite the record energy prices we are witnessing. Although, speaking of energy, surely many of you have the feeling that Russia has the upper hand, right? Well, what if we told you that in the medium and long term, and contrary to what everyone thinks, Russia needs Europe more than Europe needs Russia? You don't believe me? Take a look at this chart. In the graph on the left, you can see the countries where the gas exported by Russia is destined to go, while the graph on the right shows the origin of the gas imported by the European Union. As I said, Russia is much more dependent on Europe to export its gas than Europe is on Russia to buy it. In short, not only is Russia being hit hard by the economic sanctions, but also its position as a gas exporter is not particularly strong. But what would happen if Russia decides to replace the countries to which it sells gas in order to be less dependent on Europe and to be able to put more pressure on supplies? Well, it would face insurmountable logistical problems. Russia exports gas mainly through pipelines installed in the west of the country, so the idea of sending all the gas it is selling to Europe to China or India instead would be almost impossible. Not to mention that countries like China, unlike what we have seen in Europe, take the issue of energy security very seriously. Be that as it may, if we had to draw 3 conclusions from everything that we have told you, they would be the following. Firstly, if the ruble is so strong, this is not due to the strength of the Russian economy, but it is precisely a consequence of Putin's own sanctions and financial repression. Secondly, even though all the media are giving us a hard time about it, the exchange rate is not exactly useful for knowing whether or not the sanctions are affecting the prosperity of the Russian economy. Indicators such as Russian consumption or inflation can be used for that. And thirdly, all indications are that Russia's inflation, loss of economic activity, the flight of its skilled workers, and its complicated ability to diversify gas supplies are indeed seriously affecting its economic prosperity. And what is even worse for Moscow, the effect of the sanctions will be greater over time. In fact, this situation is what explains why Moscow is starting to call for an end to sanctions. Look at this.
5th of September 2022. Russia admits it will not resume supply to Europe through the Nord Stream pipeline. The Kremlin has made the reactivation of the pipeline, cut last Friday due to alleged technical failures, conditional on the lifting of Western sanctions.
In the same vein, a confidential Russian government report accessed by Bloomberg indicates that the Russian economy will not recover its pre-war production level until at least the end of this decade or the beginning of the next. This implies an economic debacle and, in relative terms, a massive impoverishment of Russian society. And take note that this is a forecast by the Russian government itself, which also points out that many essential industries will see their production decline due to the lack of key components and technologies. In any case, as we've already said, due to the opacity of its institutions, knowing in detail what is happening inside the country is a very, very complicated task. And that's why we now open the debate to you. Do you think the economic sanctions are working as claimed? Do you think Europe is suffering more than Russia? Or would you say the opposite is true? And finally, do you think the sanctions are sufficient, excessive, or would you tighten them even more? As always, you can leave me your answers in the comments. If you found this video interesting, then don't forget to like it and subscribe to the VisualEconomik channel if you haven't already done so yet. All the best, I'll see you next time.